Welcome to week 5. I'm going to finish up chapter 5, socialization, with just a short discussion of agents of socialization and the life cycle, and I think that will finish us up. In this chapter, or in this lecture, I'm going to talk about social groups and institutional groups that provide socialization. These are in our social world. I'm going to talk about the life cycle and the life stages, which provide major points of socialization. And then we'll talk about something called resocialization, where, when, and how this might occur. Okay, first of all, a definition. Agents of socialization, according to your text, are social groups, institutions, and individuals that provide situations, structured situations, and you'll see like education, your job, etc. That's what we mean by structured. They're organized, where socialization occurs. We've divided them into two categories, social groups and then the institutional groups. What we include under social groups are the family and peer groups. And of course, we cannot emphasize enough how important these two parts of our social environment are. We saw in the video with Jeannie how important the family can be. The family can provide those early stages of development, the invitation or whatever stage, whatever you want to call the stage, because these are your significant others. The other thing that I want to emphasize about family and peer groups too is that they are changing so quickly and so much today. We have a whole chapter devoted by family, and we will look at some of that social change because I think it's tremendously important. Social change has always been occurring, but it usually was spread over a much longer period of time. Hundreds of years, thousands of years. Now we're talking about decades, years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, in which tremendous changes have taken place, both in our society and in these groups. Okay, peer groups too, the changes, believe it or not, are occurring. These are your friends, very, very important, but we're seeing a lot of research where young people are saying, I don't have friends, I just have these people on the internet, or I play games with, or whatever. And so even that is beginning to change. Okay, we're going to briefly talk about these 4 institutional groups: schools, religion, workplace, and mass media. Schools were formerly built for the general public to educate people to work in factories. In fact, the system that we have is still referred to as the factory model. And yet we have no factories today. So we really need to talk about what is the purpose, what is the function that schools are doing today, and whether they're fulfilling that function. We will cover that chapter later in the semester. But I also want to talk now about the function that maybe schools were not intended, but it's very important. They socialize children into behaviors. The first thing you learned in kindergarten was to share, that you learn how to play in teams, that you learn a schedule, that the session is 50 minutes long, the bell rings, and you change to another classroom. And so all of these are behaviors that are taught or socialized into children. The second one is religion. It's a category that I have a particular interest in. I did not cover it in this introductory class because simply we ran out of time. But if your family is particularly tied to a religious type of institution, this is where a lot of morality is learned. How to be good, how to be bad, what is good, what is bad, what is expected of us. It also forms a community. There are formal rituals for taking children into the religious institution, whether it be confirmation, a bar mitzvah, any kind of rite of passage. Religion also, if you think about it, plays a part in the larger society and socializes people to think about things like separation of church and state, that religious symbols are all around us. And so, it's an important institution. Of course, the workplace also does a lot of socialization. Believe it or not, it's not something that you're going to necessarily learn in college. Probably an internship might be the best thing to be socialized into the workplace. But, doctors have to learn what is expected of them in terms of their dress, their behavior, their social life, as in the same way that factory workers, if we had any factories, would have to be socialized into being on time, punching the time buttons or whatever, that what you wear to a particular place or to a particular workplace, how you interact with your colleagues. Do you work as a team or do you work individually and then come together? So all of these things are socialization. Of course, the mass media is probably giving us more information than we really need, but they are promoting certain ideas that are part of our socialization, whether it's the shows that kids watch on Saturday morning or it's the news that you watch. This is where most people pick up their material culture. What clothes are in style? What things should you buy? What is the latest gadget that you just have to have? You have to talk to Alexa, every morning to organize the household and all of that along the way. But also the non-material culture, what is true, what is important, and what is happening out in the world that you should react to. Certainly movies have played a very important part in this mass media because they give us so much images, gender roles, the way that people dress, the way that people act. So all of these institutional groups are very important. And like I said, we will talk about the education system. We'll also talk about the economy later and continue to bring in social media, mass media, as we talk about all of these. Obviously, socialization takes place throughout the life course. We have to be socialized into school. We have to be socialized into the workplace, into a partnership or a marriage. We have to be socialized, believe it or not, into how to be a grandparent, how to be a senior citizen, and then some of the expectations as people do continue through this cycle. Now, generally speaking, the life cycle goes by ages, and there are cultural expectations. Some societies would expect a child or a person of 13 to go to work, whereas in American society, that person at that age is just entering into adolescence, which we have defined as being a kind of crazy time where people are allowed to do kind of interesting things. And believe it or not, this really did not exist in American society until after World War II. We did not have a life stage known as adolescence. Usually people graduated from school at age 8, the 8th grade rather, so that would be what, about 12 or 13. But as we continued and did not need these children in the workplace, a new life stage of adolescence began to occur, teenagers. And we had behavioral expectations. As we now go into an extended life, people are living longer. One of the fastest growing age groups are those that are 85 plus years. So now we have certain expectations for those people. Where should they live? How should they live? What kinds of activities are appropriate for them? Whereas before that was for the people who were 65. Right now we think of 65 as being not old age, but of course a more maybe retirement age or getting to retirement age. And we define retirement as a time to travel, to go on trips. So my point is that we have redefined stages of the life cycle. It is different for every society, but it also is different through the time period. Okay, I've talked a little bit about the time period, but certainly you can see something like the family, how it existed in 1935, how it exists today. I'm using, of course, Modern Family from a couple years back. Enjoyable show on television to look at how the family has changed through time, etc. So obviously the historical time period is going to affect how we define life stages and the expectations in those stages. Social location, we'll talk more about this in future chapters, but certainly social class affects how we define life experiences or life expectations. A very rich family may define certain expectations for an 18-year-old as opposed to a family that lives in poverty. And so we have to think about social class. We also think about race and ethnicity, and of course gender. So all of these we'll talk about in future chapters. Now here's a term, resocialization, that we obviously just are giving a name to a concept, because I'm sure we all know this in our head, but let's give it a name, okay? That we are constantly learning new role expectations as we move from being a teenager to being an adult to being middle-aged. There are different expectations. When we become a parent, we have different expectations. This is a process of resocialization. The point that we're making here is that it can be very subtle. Right now, you're going through a process of resocialization. You're going from being a high school student to being a college student. And I'm sure you have heard it 500 times. College is not like high school, right? And so that tells you that there are different expectations for how you behave. There are different values. This is resocialization, but it's very subtle, okay? Sometimes there can be very intense resocialization. These generally occur in what are called total institutions. These total institutions are ones that you don't have any control, right? Suppose you go into a prison. You don't have any control about how you live there. If you go into the military, there are very rigid expectations. Same thing is true with the hospital. I don't know if you've had that experience, but every time I've been in the hospital, it's like, please get me out of here tomorrow because I can't stand it. You know, their schedule is different than my schedule. We do see it in cults, unfortunately. That's a very intense resocialization, all right, where people are stripped of their identity. It's called a degrading is what I'm saying, ceremony, where people's identity is removed from them and then a new identity is built. Okay, this finishes chapter 5. We have talked a lot about socialization. It is a very important process and it continues through your life cycle. There are many things around us, people and institutions that provide socialization. We're going to be talking next about groups, which provide a lot of influence on people. In the United States, we do have norms that are enforced for every age cycle. If you violate those norms, people look at you like kind of crazy, right? We do have what is called resocialization that occurs as people move through these life stages and as they go into new social situations.